Are you deaf, old man? Or just stupid? The voice was sharp, cutting through the crisp morning air like a whip crack. It belonged to a young captain, his jaw set in a mask of pure annoyance, his uniform pressed to a razor's edge. This is a live-fire training area, not a bird-watching sanctuary. Now get out of here before you get yourself killed. The old man, who couldn't have been a day under 85, didn't flinch. He stood on the edge of the muddy track, his hands clasped behind his back, observing the distant figures of soldiers moving through a simulated village. He wore a simple, well-worn tweed jacket, gray slacks, and a pair of sturdy but scuffed leather shoes. Everything about him screamed civilian, and a rather unremarkable one at that. Everything, that is, except his eyes. They were a pale, clear blue, and they held a stillness that was both unsettling and profound. He turned his head slowly, his gaze landing on the captain. "I'm just observing," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to come from deep within his chest. It held no fear, no defensiveness, just a simple statement of fact. Captain Evans scoffed, a smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. He was young, ambitious, and convinced that the world ran on regulations he had memorized. An old man in the wrong place was a disruption, a problem to be managed with maximum efficiency and minimal respect. Observing? What are you, a tactical genius in your spare time, Pops? This is United States Army property. It's restricted. That means he jabbed a finger toward the old man's chest. You are not allowed to be here. Two young privates, barely out of their teens, flanked the captain, their rifles held at a low ready. They mirrored Evans's arrogance, their faces a mixture of youthful confidence and eagerness to impress their commanding officer. One of them snickered. The old man's gaze drifted past the captain to the soldiers. He saw the tension in their shoulders, the way their knuckles were white on their weapons. He'd seen that look 1,000 times before, in 1,000 different places, on faces far younger than these. The look of boys trying desperately to be men in a world that demanded it of them too soon. "It's been a long time since I've seen this post," the old man said, his voice soft with something that sounded like nostalgia. "It's changed." "I'll bet it has," Evans sneered, his patience wearing dangerously thin. "Now, I'm not going to tell you again. Turn around and walk back the way you came before I have you detained for trespassing on a federal installation." He gestured dismissively with his hand. "Go on. Shoo." The old man didn't move. His feet seemed rooted to the earth. A flicker of something ancient and unyielding sparked in his clear blue eyes. It was the same look a mountain gives to a thunderstorm, a silent, immovable presence that has weathered far worse and will remain long after the noise has passed. This quiet defiance infuriated Captain Evans more than any shouted argument could have. It was a challenge to his authority, made all the more insulting by the man's apparent frailty. "All right, that's it," Evans snapped, his face flushing with anger. "You want to do this the hard way? Fine," he nodded to the two privates. "Gentlemen, escort this individual off the premises. Use necessary force if you have to." The two soldiers hesitated for a fraction of a second. There was something about the old man's stillness that gave them pause. He wasn't resisting, but he wasn't complying either. He was simply there. But the captain's order was direct. One of the privates, a kid named Miller, stepped forward. "Sir, you need to come with us now," he said, his voice trying for firmness but cracking slightly. He reached out and placed a hand on the old man's shoulder. The moment the young soldier's fingers closed around the worn tweed of his jacket, the world dissolved for Arthur Blackwood. The crisp autumn air of the training ground vanished, replaced by the thick, cloying humidity of a jungle in Southeast Asia. The scent of pine and damp earth was gone, overwhelmed by the smell of mud, cordite, and blood. The distant pop-pop-pop of the training exercise morphed into the deafening, chaotic symphony of an active firefight. He wasn't an old man in a jacket anymore. He was 25 years old, his uniform soaked in sweat and monsoon rain. A hand was on his shoulder, but it wasn't a young private's. It was the hand of Sergeant Frank Costello, his radio man, his friend. Frank's fingers were digging into his shoulder, trying to pull him back into the relative cover of a bomb crater. "Lieutenant, get down. They've got the whole ridgeline zeroed in." Arthur could feel the thud of enemy machine gun rounds chewing up the earth just inches from his boots. He could hear the desperate cries of his men, pinned down, scattered across the hillside. Frank's hand slipped. Arthur turned, just in time to see a blossom of red appear on his friend's chest. Frank's eyes went wide, not with fear, but with a look of profound surprise, as if he'd just been told a joke he didn't quite understand. He slumped forward, his dead weight pressing Arthur into the mud. The radio on his back crackled with unheard orders, a ghost in the machine. The memory was so real, so visceral, it was a physical blow. For a split second, the quiet old man on the training ground was gone, and in his place stood a young lieutenant surrounded by death, his heart a cold, hard knot of fury and grief. His posture shifted. The slight stoop of age vanished, replaced by the ramrod straightness of a soldier under fire. His jaw tightened, and his clear blue eyes, no longer placid, became chips of ice, scanning the terrain for threats with a focus that was terrifying in its intensity. Back in the present, Private Miller felt the change. The shoulder under his hand, which had felt like frail, old bone, suddenly felt like a block of granite. The old man's entire presence had transformed. He wasn't looking at Captain Evans anymore. He was looking through him, his gaze fixed on something 1,000 yards and 50 years away. "What's wrong with him?" the other private whispered, taking a half-step back. Captain Evans saw it too. The unnerving shift in demeanor. The sudden, dangerous energy radiating from the old man. It rattled him, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. He's probably having a senior moment. Grab his other arm, and let's get him out of here. Now, as the second private reached for him, the old man blinked. The jungle faded. The sounds of battle receded. He was back on the muddy track at Fort Benning. But the echo of the memory remained. His hand, gnarled with age but still steady, came up and gently covered Private Miller's hand on his shoulder. "Son," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an authority that silenced the birds in the trees. "I recommend you take your hand off me." It wasn't a threat. It was a piece of advice, delivered with the calm certainty of a man who understood the consequences of things far better than they did. Private Miller, unnerved, snatched his hand back as if he'd been burned. Meanwhile, a mile away at the base operations center, a senior non-commissioned officer, Master Sergeant Cole, stood by a window overlooking the training ranges. He'd been watching the distant confrontation through a pair of high-powered binoculars. He hadn't been able to hear the words, but he'd seen enough. He'd seen the arrogant posture of the young captain and the quiet, unyielding stance of the old man. Something about the way the old man held himself, the economy of his movements, set off alarm bells in Cole's mind. It was a posture he'd seen only in a very specific, very rare type of soldier. The old breed. The ones who had been through the real fire. "That's not right," Cole muttered to himself. He'd seen Evans operate before. The captain was all spit and polish on the outside, but he lacked the quiet confidence of a true leader. He mistook bullying for command. Cole picked up his phone. He didn't call security. He called the office of the base commander, Colonel Davies. "Sir, Master Sergeant Cole, apologies for bothering you, but we might have a situation in Training Area 7. Captain Evans is confronting a civilian, an elderly gentleman." And the colonel's voice came back, impatient. "Have security handle it." "Sir, with respect, I don't think this is a security issue. There's something about this man. The way he stands. I think you might want to see this for yourself, sir. Evans is about to put hands on him." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Colonel Davies trusted Cole's instincts. The master sergeant had been in the army longer than Evans had been alive and had a sixth sense for trouble. "I'm on my way." Back at the muddy track, Captain Evans had reached his breaking point. His authority had been challenged, his orders ignored, and his men were now hesitating. It was an unacceptable loss of face. "I gave you a direct order," he roared at the privates. "Detain him." He lunged forward, deciding to do it himself. He grabbed the old man's other arm, his grip tight and punishing. "You are coming with me, you stubborn old fool." Just as his fingers dug into the fabric of the tweed jacket, the sound of a vehicle approaching at high speed tore through the air. A black command Humvee fishtailed to a stop just yards away, kicking up a spray of mud and gravel. The passenger door flew open and out stepped Colonel Davies, his face a thundercloud. Davies was a man in his late 50s, a combat veteran himself, with a chest full of ribbons that told the story of a long and distinguished career. He took in the scene in a single, sweeping glance. The furious Captain Evans with his hands on the old man, the two hesitant privates, and the old man himself, standing there with a look of weary patience. And then the colonel's eyes locked onto the old man's face. The blood drained from Colonel Davies's own. His professional fury evaporated, replaced by a look of utter, profound shock, followed by something that bordered on reverence. His back snapped ramrod straight. He brought his hand up in the sharpest, most precise salute he had ever rendered in his life. "General Blackwood, sir." The colonel's voice boomed across the training ground, filled with a mixture of horror and awe. "My God, sir. My apologies." Captain Evans froze, his hands still gripping the old man's arm. He stared at his commanding officer as if the colonel had lost his mind. "Sir? What did you say?" Colonel Davies ignored him. His eyes were still fixed on the man they now knew as General Blackwood. The general slowly, almost tiredly, returned the salute with a slight nod of his head. "At ease, Colonel. It's been a long time. Just Arthur now." Davies did not stand at ease. If anything, he stood even straighter. He turned his head, and the fury returned, now magnified 100-fold and directed squarely at the bewildered Captain Evans. "Captain," he said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal growl. "Let go of the general." Evans, utterly confused, dropped his hands as if the old man's arms were white-hot steel. He looked from the colonel's apoplectic face to the old man's calm one, his mind struggling to process the impossible. "General? This frail old man in a shabby jacket? It had to be a mistake." "Sir, I don't understand," Evans stammered. "This man was trespassing in a restricted zone. He refused to comply with my orders." "He refused to comply?" Davies took a menacing step forward, his voice dripping with ice. "Captain Evans, do you have any idea who you just put your hands on? Do you have any concept of the man you just called an old fool?" The colonel didn't wait for an answer. He turned to face the two privates, who looked like they wanted the earth to swallow them whole. "You two, do you know who this is?" He jabbed a finger toward Arthur Blackwood. "This is General Arthur Blackwood. Retired. He was the commanding general of this entire post 20 years ago. Before that, he was the commander of all army forces in Europe. Before that, he was one of the founding members of the unit you kids know today as Delta Force. But that was after his 3 tours in Vietnam." Davies's voice rose with every sentence, a crescendo of righteous indignation. He turned his glare back to Evans. On his first tour, as a lieutenant, his platoon was ambushed and pinned down. His radio man was killed right next to him. Lieutenant Blackwood, under heavy machine gun and mortar fire, single-handedly charged 3 enemy bunkers, silencing them with grenades and his rifle. He was wounded twice, but refused evacuation until every one of his surviving men was airlifted out. For that action, Captain, he was awarded the Medal of Honor. A collective gasp went through the small group. The Medal of Honor, the highest, most sacred award. Captain Evans's face went pale, a sickly, chalky white. He looked at the old man, at the clear, steady eyes, and for the first time, he saw not frailty, but a history he couldn't possibly comprehend. But Colonel Davies wasn't finished. On his second tour, he was a captain, running long-range reconnaissance patrols deep in enemy territory. Operations so classified they're still sealed. On his third tour, he was a major, advising units whose names you're not cleared to hear. He fought at Hamburger Hill. He was at the siege of Khe Sanh. This man has bled on 3 continents for this country, for the very uniform you wear so arrogantly. He has forgotten more about tactics, leadership, and courage than you will ever learn. The ground you are standing on? He probably designed the training protocols for it. He's not trespassing, Captain. He's coming home. The silence that followed was absolute. It was broken only by the chirping of a distant bird. The weight of the colonel's words settled over them, a crushing physical presence. Evans stared at General Blackwood, his mouth hanging slightly open. The image of this quiet, dignified elder was now superimposed with images of a young hero charging enemy guns, of a seasoned operator deep behind enemy lines. He felt a wave of nausea and shame so profound it made his knees weak. He had laid his hands on a living legend. He had called him a fool. The 2 privates were frozen in place, their faces etched with a mixture of awe and mortification. They looked at the old man's gnarled hands and tried to imagine them holding a rifle in the jungles of Vietnam. They looked at his worn tweed jacket and tried to picture the Medal of Honor that must have once hung around his neck. A hero, a legend, standing right there in front of them, and they had treated him like a nuisance. General Blackwood finally broke the silence. He looked at Colonel Davies, a faint, sad smile on his lips. "That's enough, Colonel." The boy didn't know. The simple act of grace was more damning than any punishment. It highlighted the chasm between the general's quiet dignity and the captain's blustering pride. Davies, however, was not yet ready to extend such grace. "That's the entire point, sir. He should have known. Not who you are, specifically, but what you represent. He should have shown respect for an elder, for any citizen, regardless of who they are. We don't lead by intimidation, Captain," he roared, turning back to Evans. "We lead by example. And the example you just set makes me sick. You are a disgrace to that rank and to this army." Captain Evans looked as if he'd been physically struck. His arrogance had been stripped away, leaving behind a raw, humiliated young man. His eyes welled up, and he struggled to speak. "Sir, General, there are no words. I am so sorry." His voice was a choked whisper. He looked at General Blackwood, and the shame in his eyes was genuine and absolute. "I was arrogant, disrespectful. I failed. There is no excuse, sir." General Blackwood watched him for a long moment. He saw the broken pride, the dawning of a painful but necessary lesson. He saw not an enemy, but a young soldier who had lost his way. He stepped forward, his old joints protesting slightly, and stood directly in front of Captain Evans. The colonel tensed, ready to intervene again, but the general raised a hand to stop him. "Look at me, Captain," Arthur said, his voice calm and even. Evans forced himself to meet the general's gaze. "That uniform you wear, it's not armor to make you feel powerful. It's a responsibility. It means you belong to something larger than yourself. It means you serve the people of this country, not the other way around. The people you were just calling pops and old fool people like me." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I was your age once, full of fire and certainty. I learned, the hard way, that certainty is a luxury you can't afford in a real fight. Humility is your best weapon. It keeps you listening. It keeps you learning. It keeps you alive." He glanced over at the two privates, who were still standing like statues. "And it earns you the trust of your men. They don't follow the rank. They follow the man. Never forget that." He then did something that no one expected. He reached out and straightened Captain Evans's collar, which had gotten rumpled in his anger. It was a simple, paternal gesture, an act of forgiveness. "You made a mistake today, son. A bad one. But the mistake doesn't have to define you. What you do next, that will." With that, he turned to Colonel Davies. "I came to see how the new generation was shaping up. I'd like to watch the rest of this exercise, if that's all right with you, Colonel." "Of course, General. Anything you want," Davies said, his voice still thick with emotion. Captain Evans stood frozen, watching as the legendary general and the base commander began walking toward the observation tower. He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Master Sergeant Cole, who had walked over from the command vehicle. "Toughest lessons are the ones that hurt the most, sir," Cole said quietly, not unkindly. "But they're the ones that stick." Evans could only nod, his throat too tight to speak. He watched General Blackwood's retreating form, the slight stoop now looking less like frailty and more like the weight of a lifetime of service, carried with unimaginable grace. He had been given a second chance, a lesson from living history. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone and then filled him with a new, sober resolve, that he would spend the rest of his career trying to be worthy of it. The day he had tried to take down an old veteran had become the day an old veteran had started to build him into a true leader. We live in a world that often judges by the cover, by the uniform, by the title, or by the lack of one. We forget that the greatest strength is often quiet, that the deepest wisdom is often hidden behind a weathered face and a simple jacket. The story of General Blackwood and Captain Evans is a powerful reminder to look deeper, to listen harder, and to treat every single person with the dignity and respect they deserve. You never know when you might be standing in the presence of a giant. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please consider liking this video, subscribing to our channel for more content like this, and sharing it with someone who understands that true honor isn't worn on a sleeve, but carried in the heart.